Hello, Smart Money Tree podcast listeners. Welcome to this week's show. My name is Kirk Chisholm, and I'll be your host. So today I'm joined with Mary Martin. How you doing today, Mary?
I'm okay today. How are you?
Good. I'm doing great. Doing better than okay. How's
Nice.
so tell us a little about your background. We brought you on the show because one of the challenges with investing in money is what's in your head. And I wanted to kind of bring Mary on to really help us understand, how our brains work so that we can be better investors. So Mary, tell us a little bit about your background.
I have a doctorate in what happens in your brain when you're learning from New York University. And the funny story about that is it's not I didn't do this 5 minutes ago. I'm not a young person. I am an early Gen Xer. And so everything I learned about the brain has since been disproven. So I had to sort of keep up with what's going on with study about the brain. And my PhD sort of turned into writing books for some strange reason, and largely in the financial services industry and largely about financial planning, and then into writing curriculum for CFP study guides, certified financial planning study guides, and various licensing study guides, including the items for those tests and the cases for those tests. And then I was the learner in chief for the Sudden Money Institute for almost 8 years. And now I'm still writing on my own. And in the middle there, started to learn how to teach mindfulness because I had a mindfulness practice. And it really changed my life in a lot of ways. And I wanted to share it with people, and particularly with financial advisors. So I wrote a book about that, and I started a class on that in 2019. And I've been teaching financial advisors and others, parents and children, about mindfulness for the last 8 years or so. And so I do that, and I keep up with neuroscience because I'm just one little person. I'm not some giant organization that has to kind of filter information down through the ranks. So when something new comes out about how our brain really works, I can, like, on the spot, once I vet it, bring it to people. So I'm really agile that way, and I'm known for kind of bringing the latest stuff to people about how the brain works.
Nice. So you mentioned the topic of mindfulness, and I think a lot of people, when they think of mindfulness, they're just thinking of, well, it's kind of a fluffy topic, and it's maybe kind of new agey. So, tell us a little bit. Maybe you can define mindfulness and why it's important.
Sure. I use the definition from John Kabat-Zinn, who was and is a physician who started this program called mindfulness based stress reduction, MBSR. And it was originally used in hospitals, and then it went to other facilities like prisons, believe it or not, and into schools, and now into the lay public. And it is a science-based program on learning how to pay attention to your mind and body in order to increase your well-being. So he had a mindfulness practice for decades, and he brought this practice to the university, to UMass Medical Center. And he said, I have a thing that I think is going to help people who you haven't been able to help. They have chronic anxiety, they have chronic pain, they're depressed, and I think I have something here. And as the story goes, they gave him a room in the basement of UMass Medical Center, and he began teaching this program, which has been studied since 1979. And that's what I am certified to teach from Brown University's Mindfulness Center. Now, the definition is kind of cumbersome. So it is paying attention non-judgmentally to what's happening in the present moment. And so you think, oh, well, I already do that. Well, maybe not. I know that in schools, people are constantly being told to pay attention. And the question is, like, do you know what paying attention feels like in your mind and body? So what mindfulness does is it gives you a structure and a practice and a process for kind of observing your life as it occurs from moment to moment. And when you begin doing that, you realize you haven't been doing it. You realize you're not really sure what attention is. You realize most people say, I finally woke up. I woke up. So you'll hear the phrase waking up and woke up being used, not the other woke. um, waking up being used, because you're waking up to what your life is like from moment to moment. And you're kind of usually on autopilot and you don't know what it feels like. And mindfulness teaches you what your life feels like from moment to moment.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that. So maybe you can give some examples here because I think, I understand what you're saying. Some people may not be, but maybe there's some examples you can use of how you would, implement that mindfulness or like what that would feel like to somebody.
Sure, sure. Well, they can do it right now. They can just bring their attention to their feet. Bring your attention to your feet and to whatever they're in contact with. And you're kind of looking for, do you feel weight? Do you feel heft? Do you feel gravity? Is there a temperature? So if you have shoes on your feet, your feet have a certain temperature. If your feet are bare and your house is cold, your feet have a different temperature, and the air on your skin feels like something. And if you were standing on your head, you would feel your circulation because it would be going in the other direction, right? When you get upset, you feel it. Your face gets hot, perhaps. You can feel your heartbeat change and you can feel it speed up. You can feel your hands, the skin on your hands get clammy. So all you have to do is bring your attention to something, anything. You can bring your attention to food while you're eating and what it feels like in your mouth and what color it is and what it tastes like, and is it hard, is it soft, is it creamy, do I have to chew it, is it cold, is it hot? So you can pay attention to anything in your life, and when you begin to do so, this is the important part, you're creating a brain that pays attention, because the more you do it, the more you're creating a habit of doing it. And the more attention you pay, the less likely you are to make mistakes, the less likely you are to buy something impulsively, to spend money when you don't need to fly off the handle. So cultivating awareness affects every part of your life. You can exercise mindfully. When we do daily retreats, silent retreats, we walk mindfully and we walk very slowly. So you walk as slow, and you can try it now wherever you are, podcast listener. You can walk as slowly as you possibly can without going so slow that you're going to fall over, and notice what it is like to walk. And we don't do that. We don't notice, the articulation of the foot, the heel. Do you go heel? Do you go, to your midsole? Do you go to, how do you do it? Are your toes on the floor, on the ground at all? Where do you walk evenly? Is more of your weight on your right foot or your left foot? So all of these practices, mindful eating, mindful seeing, mindful listening, sit outside in the morning, just go sit outside and listen to the morning birds at like dawn, and just listen to the sounds of your life as they come and go. And so the more places where you can kind of inject mindfulness into your life, this awareness of your life, the more you're creating neural pathways. There's those like little, you're creating these little like roads in your, I don't want to call them roads, these connections in your brain that say, I am a kind of brain who pays attention. So the more ways in which you're mindfulness throughout your life, the more ways your brain will predict that you will be mindful. So this isn't something where, oh, I listened to a podcast and boom, or oh, I read the book. It's fantastic. By the way, read the book, John Kabat-Zinn. He has a book called Full Catastrophe Living, a book called Wherever You Go, There You Are. And the more, even though it's wonderful to read the book, there's only one way that's going to get you to pay attention more, and it's by paying attention more.
Yeah, I love that, and I think it's challenging because I think a lot of people who are listening to this, and I want to tie it back to investing because otherwise people be like, "What are we listening to?" Um, I think it's really important to understand the context, which is why we're starting here, which is, there's a few things. One is this will make you a better investor. And two is habit formation is not simple or easy, and it takes time and it takes repetition. And as you're saying, Mary, like you need to build these neuro connections, these neurons. You need to strengthen the neurons, the habits. And in order to do that, you have to start somewhere. And I bring this up because we live in a world, Mary and I are both Gen X, and we live in a world where, especially the younger generation, it's all about grabbing your attention, and it's all about, keeping your attention on things that don't matter, like bells and whistles and pop-ups and notifications and this and that. And it doesn't allow you to do what they call deep work, right? Deep work is like intentionally focused work. You have no distractions. You can get a lot of stuff done versus, oh, hold on, that was a message, I need to handle that. Oh, hold on, I need to do this. Like, you rewire your brains, and then your brains can't focus anymore. And because you can't focus, you're basically creating a habit of not focusing, which reinforces a habit of not focusing. What Mary's talking about is reinforcing a habit of focus, which will help you focus better, which will help you it's like a positive reinforcement loop. So when it comes to investing, and I want to ask Mary this, I want to stop talking. This is Mary's interview, not mine, is how this applies to investing. So Mary, all of this being said, why is this important to investing?
Because it's important to your emotions, and your emotions are intimately tied to your investing. So when you become more mindful, what you notice is how you're on the daily, you notice where your emotions come from, you notice what triggers your emotions, you notice how you end up creating your emotions and under what circumstances, you notice your feelings of urgency around, let's say, I don't know, your notifications and social media. You start to notice how much time you're wasting. You start to notice what you feel like before you buy something. Do you have a sense of urgency? You have this like deep want, this deep desire. And when you practice, what you notice is all of your feelings come and go very quickly if you don't like feed them and you don't engage them. And what happens with money is it can be such a charged topic for people that they become really engaged in it and really emotional. And at that point, they have lost their ability to be a choice. Like you've lost the game already. And you are no longer in charge of what you're going to do next, because you have this freight train of your emotions that you have jumped on, and it is going in one place and you can't get it back. But the more you practice being aware of your emotions as they arise and as they pertain to money, and I do this with my daughter all the time. She has a journal, and she has to write, if she's going to spend that money, she has to write down what she's feeling when she wants to spend the money, why she wants to spend the money, and does it have something to do with it socially? Is it because other kids have the thing and I want to get the thing? So we want to get to the emotions around spending the money, and then she has to wait. So if you bake in waiting and you don't make decisions immediately, if you go into a store and you pick up the like the $500 t-shirt, which by the way, I've done so many times, and it's a t-shirt, and I just give myself 5 minutes. What am I feeling? I'm going to walk around the store for 5 minutes. And guess what happens in 5 minutes? I noticed that I'm completely delusional, and I was going to buy a $500 t-shirt, and I put it back on the rack. But in that moment, had I not noticed what was going on in my body, and had I not noticed my urgency and my like deep need, like for survival, I had to buy the t-shirt, then I would have bought the silly t-shirt. So you can create processes for yourself and accountability that help you deal with your emotional moments. And the same thing happens with food, by the way. How many times do we all go into the kitchen, open up the refrigerator, and just stare at it? And then just like pick something and randomly eat it for no reason. So something is always happening in the body and in the mind that propels you to pick up the thing, want to spend the money, want to eat the food, and you need to notice that. And there are ways you can work with it. There's lots of like breathing and movement stuff you could do, but you're just going to notice it, and you're just going to promise to not do anything. And what you notice most frequently is that those feelings of urgency that you had pass, but you have to let them. and you can't get involved with them. So the more you practice mindfulness, the more you notice these emergent emotions, and then you can experiment with yourself. Okay, let me like really get into this emotion and let me like really think about it and engage with it. It gets bigger and bigger and bigger. This happens with all emotions. You feed them, they get bigger. You ignore them, they get smaller, they go away. And so around money, when you are feeling like you absolutely have to do something, that's the moment you should probably not do it, and you should allow those feelings to pass, and allow yourself to look at the situation more objectively without all those emotions racing through your body.
Yeah, that's great. So, if I think about it, like, just take it to the investor standpoint, right? I'm an investor. I have a losing trade. I lose money. My dog chews up my favorite, item, or I make money, right? On a winning trade, right? It doesn't matter whether you're winning or losing, right? And, I initially get triggered, right? Because the emotions kind of take over. It's like gambling, right? You're up, you're winning, or you're losing, and it just kind of takes over your brain. So it's really hard in those moments to make executive decisions, right? The executive part of the brain. It's hard to make those decisions because your emotions are flying. You're in the moment. You can't just sit down and do meditation in the middle of the casino. So what do how would you kind of recommend people kind of build up to that? Because those are very, greed and fear are very strong emotions.
You just said it because you said build up. So when you're in the casino or when the dog has eaten the thing and you've had that trade that didn't go your way, that is the last time that you're going to be able to do something for yourself. Like, so when you're in that moment, your entire nervous system is compromised, your brain is compromised, and you have only bad decisions ahead of you. Like, honestly, you need to stop, which is actually one of the practices. It's called stop. It's called stop, which stands for stop, take a breath, observe, and proceed. But the thing about the stop practice, they do that for kids too, and they call it STAR, stop, take a breath, and relax, right? But the last time that you're ever going to do that is when you're upset. So there's a fatal flaw in this whole program with stop and with STAR. But if you build up to it, it becomes a habit. So you don't say, okay, I'm going to start trying to practice this thing in the casino. It's not what you do. You practice when there is nothing at stake. You're in your house, you've just had your morning coffee, it's a beautiful day, you don't have a ton of pressure on yourself, and you're gonna start practicing, and you practice a little bit every day. And the reason for practicing when nothing much is happening is to give yourself a fighting chance. So you're setting yourself up for success, to develop a sort of a way of being that is more aware and that pays attention more. And the way you do that is when you're in the condition to do that, so that later, as you say, you have built up to it, so that later, when that happens to you, you know what to do. And I don't mean know like you think. You don't have to think at all. Your brain predicts, oh, I don't do this anymore. Here's what I do now. In a situation like this, I ground myself, maybe, with my feet. I take a couple of really deep breaths. I notice what's happening in my body, and I name it, maybe, who knows? And I allow it to pass. But that only comes after you have practiced doing that a lot. So, absent having somebody next to you who says, dude, you need to stop, take a breath, and relax, in which case you would do that. But that's not what happens. Like, you don't have somebody following you around all day. But if you had, maybe you're so in a condition where you need to have a buddy. So you have a buddy system, and somebody can tell you to stop, take a breath, and relax. But until then, you have to learn how to do it yourself. And although it is difficult at first, it gets easier because it starts to show up in your behavior naturally. You're not thinking about it. So the point is to get to the point where you're not saying, oh, I have to stop, take a breath. And you don't think about it. Your brain predicts that that's what you do. Does that make sense?
It does. It makes perfect sense. So let me ask you, so, obviously this is very important when it comes to investing. Um, what are some other, I guess you call them cognitive biases or other things that people can do to improve their success when it comes to investing or money habits?
So cognitive biases, I mean, a lot of them make a lot of sense. A lot of behavioral finance is based on kind of saying, well, your emotions are involved and you're not behaving rationally. And to your brain, it's perfectly rational. So when your brain decides to do something, it's usually for a really good reason. If it's predicting that you should be upset about something, it's usually for a good reason. So I kind of I don't like to deal in biases because I don't agree. They don't really map onto how the brain works. So the brain being predictive, it's constantly getting this information from the outside world, and then it kind of brings that to your brain. It doesn't mean anything yet. It's just like stuff. It's data it gets from your sense organs. And one of those pieces of data, which is really important, is what's happening inside you, which it's called interoception, but it's like your feelings. And it's like, are you in a good mood or not? Did your dog just eat your thing? Did you just lose something? Did you just lose money? And if you're already not in a great state, your brain isn't going to predict anything good for you. It's going to predict what it needs to do to protect itself and that how it has protected itself in the past. So what your brain is really doing is it's running your whole body and it's trying to keep it all going and it doesn't want to freak it out. And so it's really, Lisa Feldman Barrett calls it your body budget. So your brain is running your whole body and it's trying to keep you balanced. And sometimes keeping you balanced means a trauma response, means a bias because it's worked in the past. So if you're behaving in a way that you've behaved in the past, your brain is going to keep predicting that you're going to behave that way. So it's not so much a bias as it's a habit. It's a habitual way of thinking. And once you see that in yourself through practice, you can change the way you think. You don't have to believe all of your thoughts. That's another thing we do. We believe our thoughts. You don't need to believe them. So we have thoughts that happen that you don't need to believe. We have emotions that come and go, but we don't let them. So we're not working with our bodies and brains. We're working against them. And that's really the problem. The problem is a lack of understanding of what's actually happening within you. So you're working against yourself all the time. So as an investor, A, slow down. B, notice what's happening in your body when you're making decisions. And if you're not feeling pleasant, if you're over caffeinated, if you're under caffeinated, if you're in pain, if you're angry because you had an argument with your partner, if your foot really hurts, we don't think of these things as affecting us, but they affect your decision making. They affect the way you invest. So how you feel in the moment affects what you do with your money. And I don't think people understand that. So getting to know how your body is feeling from moment to moment affects your investing because it allows you to learn about when you do certain things. You start to make it's called insight. You start to make connections. Oh, when I feel like I tend to make this kind of decision with money. I tend to invest like this when I feel like that. So you learn about yourself. You learn about what works for you, which is different from what works for me. That's another reason. This is like there's no rule that works for everybody. You're learning about yourself and what works for you. And in order to do that, you need to look at your data, what's happening with your investments, what happens with your decisions when you make those decisions, what was happening around the time. How did you feel when you made those decisions? So there's a load of stuff you can't control, but you can control when you're making your decisions and whether you pull the trigger on them based on how you're feeling in the moment.
So one question obviously comes up is we can't always be in charge or in control of how we feel, the time of day, all of that. So what are some systems people can put in place to help support the times when they're maybe a little off, but they still have to make a decision, right? You don't feel great every day. Not every day is, a rock star day. So what can people do to help make sure that they're on track even on the bad days?
They can have somebody else. This is like, I mean, financial advisors, they don't call them thinking partners for nothing. So having somebody who is and if you're doing it on your own, you have an accountability partner. You have somebody who you can like text in a moment, and so you talk about this beforehand, and you have a little system that you work out. Like, I am not right. I'm not right now. Like, I am off, and I have to do this thing. Can you just like play this out with me? Can you just and do that with somebody else, because you almost like you can't trust yourself. You already know you're off. So you're going to be super vigilant, which is good, and you should, but it doesn't ever hurt to have somebody who has your back.
Yeah, no, that's great. I love that, and that's a a big part of what I do as well. Is you got to have a buddy system, kind of keep you,
Yeah.
if nothing else, just to tell you you're making dumb decisions, and
Yeah.
to just say, yeah, okay, you're right.
And you could
Um,
have a safe word, like, because you could be like, oh my gosh, everything is hitting the fan. I feel horrible. I have to make this decision. And, so you just like, your safe word is, this is from a show I saw the other day, gargoyle. So you're with your buddy, and all you have to say is gargoyle. And they're like, oh, wow. You're like, we know what we have to do right now. It's like DEFCON 1 for Mary. And we have to like really listen to what she's doing. So yeah, you create little systems with your buddy, that has a lot of shorthand baked in based on, you're paying attention to yourself, and that you're just not going to you're probably not going to do it right. So you need some help.
Yeah. No, that's great. And sometimes it's hard to find these buddies, and that's why you have to, find people you trust and
Yes.
find, build up. I mean, everyone's got friends, but not all the friends are good at this. So you got to find people that are kind of going through the same thing. I know I've done this for years with advisors. We just, we collaborate and help each other out and share best practices. The only way you get through this, because otherwise you're alone. We don't have that infrastructure in place, as I'm sure you know. So let me ask you this, because you mentioned earlier, being a Gen Xer and a lot of this stuff that we learned. I learned this stuff growing up, and come to find out most of, science is not really science. It's just whatever the flavor of the day is. So you mentioned there's a lot of myths, misunderstandings, things that are not accurate. Can you talk about some of those? Because I'm sure some of those are still floating around out there for people.
Sure. And this is related to the buddy thing. So the first one is like, we were taught that like your brain is your mind, and it's in your head. And it turns out that that's not really true, and that your mind extends to your whole body, your entire nervous system, and also your environment and the people that you're with, because we're mammals, because we're social mammals, we're social animals, and we have evolved these nervous systems that help and heal each other. So the best thing for you when you're upset is really another person. They could also be the worst thing depending on who the person is. But if you have a buddy, who you really trust, sometimes you don't even have to say much. And this, you could just like text them an emoji, and maybe not that, because I don't know how much you do that, but you
I'm a
don't have
Gen
to.
Xer, Mary.
I know.
I don't emoji.
Yeah, you don't have to do much, to really influence somebody else's nervous system and to make them feel better. So, and this extends to your dog, So when you're not feeling well and you go to your dog and you pet your dog and you feel better, that's for a reason. It's for a reason that you were compelled to do that. It's for a reason that you feel better when you do that, because they're mammals too. So it's called co-regulation. We co-regulate each other. So this is because your mind is your whole body. It's your surroundings. If imagine you're in like a little black jail cell versus you're at the beach, on the beach in Tahiti. you feel different. You are different. Your mind and your emotions are different based on where you're standing. So your environment is also part of your mind. And then there was this like, oh, we have a reptilian brain thing, we have a lizard brain, and our brains were formed over time with like the lizard brain first, and then the limbic system on top, and then the prefrontal cortex. Turns out that's not true. And it turns out that all of these develop at the same time, and there's different durations for their development, and that's what determines which one is bigger in any particular species. But all mammals and all vertebrates have all of these three, and a lot of birds do too. So like there's no like reptilian brain that's hijacking you, but that made for a good story, I do have to say. um Stress, this is a big one for mindfulness people and for well-being people, because we were all taught that there's stimulus, and then there's like response or reaction, and your whole point of a mindfulness practice is to put space between what happens and what you do. But it turns out you can't do that, because your brain is a predictive engine, and your brain has already predicted what you're going to do. But what you could do is you can create a brain that predicts there's space between things. Like, so it's not true that something happens and then you respond, even though that's how we tend to experience it. But it is true that you can still do something, and you can still be more aware of what's happening, and you can still change maladaptive patterns, and you can change bad behaviors. It's just the way you do it isn't kind of what we thought it was. And then finally, this is my favorite. There are universal emotions. Everybody around the world has them. They all look the same. So you could go anywhere on the world and be able to identify what somebody was feeling by the look on their face. Turns out that's not true. And that emotions are socially constructed. So we in the West, tend to have the similar emotions, and we learn them. They're not like, we're not born with them, because the poor children who were born without parents, and like the children in Romanian orphanages, there were children who were unfortunately, put in closets when they were very small and didn't have parents, didn't have caregivers. They don't develop emotions. We develop emotions by looking at the faces who are caring for us, and we start to go, oh, that's a thing, and it goes with this, and it tends to feel good. And oh, that's a thing that doesn't tend to feel good. And they learn emotions just like they learn language. So they are socially constructed, and they're different from culture to culture, and they don't all look the same. So we don't all have the same emotions. We don't all look the same when we have those emotions. And emotions aren't just like waiting to come out of us. We construct them through our environment and through our caregivers. Surprise. so, so yeah. So, and that's a lot, because I know I was taught all those myths. And had I not, kept up over these decades, I'd be walking around saying, like, there's a right hemisphere. That's another one. There's a right hemisphere and a left hemisphere, and they do separate things. And the right is creativity, and the left is, analytical thought. And that's not really true. And creativity happens when they both cooperate. And some emotions are in the left and some are in the right. So like, ditch that one as well.
I thought that was true, because I thought they looked at people who didn't have I forget what it's called, the binding in the middle, and they looked at people
Corpus
who,
callosum.
yeah, that didn't have that binding, and then they experimented based on that, and that's how they came up with the right and left. I thought that's how they originally came up with it.
Well, the funny thing about that is when some people are born without one of their hemispheres, and guess what the other one does? It
It
does
adapts.
all this. It does all the stuff.
Yeah.
So it's like, now what? So so, and it's these cases like this that make us, think about what we used to think. And then you have to, as we say, update your priors. You have to constantly update your priors when it comes to brain science. Now, fortunately, everything I just said has decades of research behind it. And when I talk about this, I talk about it's like the narrative, one of the narratives won. So the narrative about gas cars over electric won, and then the narrative about electric over hydrogen or anything else won. It doesn't mean necessarily it was the perfect thing at the time. It won.
Hmm.
So there are narratives that won, and then there was the science, and there were a handful of neuroscientists who were like, hey, like, why do you keep saying this when we know that it's not true? But it didn't matter, because I think, people built entire careers on these myths. And it's hard to come out to the world and say, that's not right. I was wrong. I'm sorry. It's really like this. So it's happening, but we were all taught stuff that was wrong.
What are you talking about, Mary? The food pyramid is still accurate. The one
The
from
food pyramid. So Maslow's thing, which this is the food pyramid. Maslow's thing is one of my favorite things. So Maslow never had a pyramid. He never had a triangle, but everybody presents his stuff as it was a triangle, but it wasn't ever. So that's another thing that we all kind of like, oops, learned. So it's tough going out there for sure. And for all of everybody on social media, which is like everybody but me and you, in particular on places like Twitter, uh, there's so much misinformation about in personal finance. Holy cow. There's so much misinformation, and getting to the heart of what is happening on any one topic just takes a Herculean effort these days, because the recommendation engines are just going to send you stuff that are getting the eyeballs on it. They're going to send you the stuff that people are engaging with. And people are most frequently engaging with things that are defamatory and things that are explosive. So don't be getting your investment advice on Twitter, anybody. And really vet anybody who you're taking advice from and the products, and don't make quick decisions. Don't make decisions based on emotions. Well, they were all based on emotions, but if we could take that out, let's be boring. Like, let's bring back boring. Let's bring back values and investing according to your actual values, not your values that you say you have, but you live different ones. So investing according to your actual values, and not trying to beat everything all the time. And you might find that it's a bit more boring than what some of your colleagues are doing, but boring might be better.
I think I'm gonna name one of my episodes "Bring Back Boring." I love that. It's a great title. I mean, it's so true. It's probably a value investing, episode. Bring Back Boring.
Yeah,
It's true, right? The less boring it is, probably the less it's a good idea. I did want to get one thing before we run out of time here, is narratives. So you mentioned narratives.
Mm.
Narratives are central to how you manipulate people right now in these days, because you've got narratives. Like, it's not about the truth, it's about a narrative. And
Yep.
whatever the winning narrative is, the one that wins.
Yep.
I heard a story about nuclear energy, and apparently there were two competing technologies. There was I forget what it's called, Epsom, not Epsom salts. There's basically a light water reactor, which we use today, and then
Mhm.
there's another one which I'm drawing a blank on, but molten salt or something like that reactor. And basically, molten salt reactors were better, and much better, in fact. However, I think it was Nixon at the time, whose home state were the ones that were coming up with the light water reactor, and so he wanted the jobs to go to his state, so he gave it to light
Oh,
water and submarine the other one. The other one was better, and that's how we got it, and we stuck with
yeah.
it. And people haven't changed, because who wants to change when you're using the status quo? It's like, oh my god, this is how the world works.
Yes.
Crazy.
That's so sad. Yeah. So stories win,
Yeah.
and that's unfortunate. And people need to peel back the layers of the story, and peel back and they get because they tug at your emotions, and then you're like all in on the story, the crypto, whatever it is, all in. And that's very dangerous. But the people who do that are so good at it. And your brain it's really, it's not a good competition. Like, your brain is going to lose almost every time to really good stories. So if that's how you're making your decisions, that is not good.
Yep. Yeah, no, I totally agree, and I think that's an ever-reaching challenge. Is what we try to do in the show is to educate people so they can think better and teach them how to think, not what to think, so they can be
Mm.
better investors. So I really appreciate you coming to the show, Mary, and sharing your wisdom with us. I know we'll probably have you back in the future because our brains are not going to change and we'll get triggered tomorrow. So,
Don't say that. I have faith. I have hope for all of you.
yes, well, it takes a lot of effort and time, and we have smart listeners, Mary. So I'm sure they'll all change. We have a good audience. So where can people find more about you, Mary?
At marymartinphd.com. That's it. I do free practices for people so they could learn about this. I have a book, and I have a blog. I write obsessively. I have 20 practices that are free, guided practices on the website, anywhere from 2 minutes to 48 minutes each. So I got lots of resources for you if you're curious and you want to learn more.
Nice. Well, once again, thanks for joining us, Mary. We'll put that on the website for those of you who want to learn more about Mary and all of her knowledge. Please check out the website, and yeah, we'll talk to you soon, Mary.
Thanks for having me, Kirk.
Hey, Doug, did you hear? We're giving away free money. Well, I'll tell you about it in a minute, but before I do, there's a saying in the mining community, well, precious metals mining, that is. The saying is that if you want the best deals, you have to be in the room. Now, you're probably thinking, what does it mean to be in the room? Well, I'll tell you. Being in the room means that you're on the short list of people who get invited to be a part of the best deals. These are the deals that most investors will never have access to. You mean like IPOs? Nope, IPOs are chump change. Those are for retail investors, small potatoes. That's nothing compared to these deals. These deals would have you salivating to get access to them. Once you know they exist, you will never look at investing the same way again. I almost don't want to even tell you that they exist because it will ruin your thinking of how the investing world really works. Now, you might be excited that these deals exist, but you only have access to the deals if you're an insider, or in the room as they call it. Now, as loyal listeners to the show, I'm going to give you a chance to be in the room. Money Tree Investing Podcast has created the Insiders Club. This is a community of our show's members who are loyal listeners of the show and want to get more out of their investing experience. Being a part of the Insiders Club gives you insider status for upcoming events and webinars, discounts, free stuff and books, and influence on the future direction of the show. This is a great opportunity to join us as we expand our content and services. Oh, and did I mention free money? Yes, in the next few weeks, I'll be giving away free money to our members of the Insiders Club as my appreciation for listening to the show. Now, there's no cost to join the Insiders Club. Just go to moneytreepodcast.com/free money today to join the community. That's www.moneytreepodcast.com/free money. I hope to see you in the room. All right. Well, that was a great interview with Mary. Really appreciate her coming on the show. Now we're into the panel portion of the show where we have our very own Tim Baker. Hey, Tim.
Hey, Kirk. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming on the show. Well, it's we're a little light on our panel today because it's summer and people are on vacation, and Tim and I were nice enough to come in and share our vacation time with all the listeners. So appreciate you coming on, Tim. So what were some of your thoughts about the interview with Mary?
Yeah, we've talked about some of this stuff before. I thought it was a really great interview, and the reason for that is for those of us with chartered financial analyst charters, how they make us say it. We just call it the CFA charter, right? So behavioral finance is actually a really big component of all of that. And Kirk, near and dear to my heart, I really liked the piece that you guys discussed on being prediction machines. Just the general cognitive biases, the way people behave when they think about investing, which, by the way, is usually very different than the way they behave in other areas of their life. And a lot of that has to do with how you treat things you understand versus how you treat things you don't understand. And there's probably a third category for how you treat things you think you understand.
Yeah, I think that's a good. I like that. That's like who is it? Rumsfeld who said there's the known knowns, the known unknowns, and the unknown unknowns, right? And
Yeah.
we all think we know everything, and
Yeah.
I think we just have to realize that that's not always the case. And yeah, I think what's interesting, the prediction machine. I mean, we're all wired to predict the future, right? We're constantly predicting whether there's a saber-toothed tiger behind that next bush, right? That's how we're wired from our primal state. And so we're always looking at like what's going to happen, which is interesting, but we're basically pattern recognition machines at the same time, right? We look at something and say, what happened the last time we did this? What happened, when we did X? What happened when we did Y? Like what happened? And let's assume it's going to repeat, right? So we're predicting based on the past. And it's interesting, but it works in life. It just doesn't work in investing. so
Yeah. Yeah,
so
no, it really does, and it's. I mean, if you think about everything that we've been going through since the beginning of 2022, uh, inflation, Federal Reserve rate hike, inflation, Federal Reserve rate hike, inflation, Federal Reserve rate hike, recession concern. Federal Reserve rate hike, recession concern, right? Because it's all based on what's happened in the past. When inflation has gotten high, the Federal Reserve has hiked interest rates, and that's pushed us into a recession. We don't know that that's going to happen this time. It might not. Certainly the course of 2022 and 2023 have not borne that out. But I do think it goes back to something that you and I and Phil actually spoke about not long ago, which was we went through like the whole list of behavioral finance and how people react to things like investing, where most people are not experts, or you and I would be out of jobs. And so there's all kinds of anchoring that goes on, and it dovetails with the recency bias, right? People think a lot about, well, where has the market been recently? We've had clients come to us and say, you know, the whole reason people come to us is we have what we consider to be a better investment philosophy. Get out of your mutual funds, which I think we're probably going to talk about that a little bit, like thinking, how do you think about the traditional versus how things have evolved. So when we tell people like, hey, we're going to liquidate these things and put you into our portfolio, we'll get questions like, what do you think is going to happen with the market over the next year, and how would that impact your strategies? And it's like, I don't know. Predicting that is extremely hard to do. We try to take a much longer term approach, and I do think that whole prediction machine piece is very focused on short term, right? Kirk, you and I will both be willing to sit here and make a prediction about where the market will be 15 years from now, where it's going to be in December, next January, next June. That would be more of, you and I would have to make a bet on that.
yeah, and I think we use a framework when we talk to clients and prospects. We use the framework of most people think about the world as outcome based thinking, right? We're gonna, who's going to get elected in the next election? The stock market is going to do this. The weather is going to be this. Like this is going to happen today. We predict. It's the way our brains are wired. It's normal, right? It's completely normal, and that is what we call outcome based thinking, right? We think we know the outcome. And as we know, frequently people are very bad at this. People are not very good at predicting outcomes. If they did, people would be wealthy beyond imagination with sports betting and with gambling and all that. And of course, they're not. So we know that outcomes are not predictable, but that's how our brains are wired. But what people don't do is they don't think about the fact that that's how their brains are wired. They're not mindful. And this is why I love talking with Mary, is they're not mindful of the fact that this is going on. And one of the important parts about investing is being mindful of how you're feeling and if you're getting triggered. So getting triggered is like, for instance, I read I don't read the news, but I read a lot of independent research. So I read some research this morning, and I could tell it wasn't data driven. It was more like emotional driven. But I was reading it. It said, oh, the market could go down 60% and the NASDAQ go down 75%. It said, well, look at like early 2000s. The NASDAQ was down 75%. I was like, a little bit different there. I'm not sure that this is completely aligned with that. I get it. You're tying the past to the future. You're saying, oh, it could happen. Like, yeah, it could happen. And monkeys could fly out of my butt, right? Like, like there's a whole bunch of things that could happen, although that latter one probably won't. I'll make that prediction.
I was
but
going to let that one go.
yeah, well, if anyone remembers that whole Wayne and Garth thing,
Right. Yep.
yeah. Anyway, so but the point being is, if you have outcome based thinking, that is going to be wildly inaccurate. At best,
Yep.
you got 50% odds as a coin flip. But if you look at a different way to look at it, which is what we call scenario based thinking, which is look at an election. Let's look at the last election, right? I'm not going to bring in politics because people hate that, but I'm just going to talk about it. So last election, there were, in my opinion, there were three potential outcomes. Either Trump could win, that was one outcome. Biden could win, that was another outcome. Or the third outcome, which is it was very unclear, right? Which was very possible at the time, based on what was going on. It could have been unclear. There could have been, we don't know who's won. So if you look at those potential, and there might have been more, but that was the three most probabilistic outcomes. So if you look at those three, you say, all right, what am I going to do if Trump wins? What am I going to do if Biden wins? What am I going to do if it's unclear? And if you have done that work, then when one of those scenarios happens, you're ready, right? You can enact your plan. You could say, all right, this has happened. Here's what I'm going to do, right? And it doesn't mean you're going to be right, but at least you're prepared for it. And what generally happens is when people aren't prepared for it, they freeze. They think, all right, what do I do now? Like I think Soros lost $1.2 billion on a bet of Hillary beating Trump, and he was wrong. 1.2 billion. I don't know what the guy's worth, but that's a heck of a lot of money. Maybe he could have shaved some of that off for me. I mean, that's just a huge amount of money lost. But because he thought it was, I mean, he tends to bet big. And he also tends to change quickly. Like if he's wrong, he changes quickly. But he bet big on that outcome. Well, obviously he was wrong. And he was wildly wrong because, most people were predicting that because it was just, it was a sure thing. She's a, whatever. But it didn't happen. So if you're not prepared for the different outcomes, you're probably not going to react quickly. And right. I don't, knowing Soros, I don't know Soros, but knowing about him, he probably reacted quickly because that's just his nature. He's a trader. But generally, most people would have been like, what do I do? Like, this is crazy. How did he win? And they spent the next 2 months wondering how this even happened instead of enacting a plan of, well, I got to take this other scenario. So the mindfulness, the reason we brought Mary on is because the mindfulness aspect of investing is so important. If you don't understand, if you can't reflect on how you're feeling and how you're thinking and how you're acting based on that, then you're going to end up making a lot of mistakes. And you're going to say, why did I make mistakes? Well, you realize it if you actually are mindful enough to think about that. So how do you do that, Tim? Like, what's your process?
So not to beat it to death, but I want to harp a little bit on, because I really like your outcome-based thinking, because it reminds me of one of the most common questions that we've been getting over the last 18 months, which is, do you think we should be lightening up on our stock positions? And my response is, why would we do that? Well, because aren't we going to go into a recession? So you're making an outcome-based prediction. Yeah, there might be a recession. What does that mean for stocks? I don't know. Go back and look at the track record. During some recessions, stocks goes up, stock goes up, stocks go up. Nice speaking. During some recessions, stocks go down. During some they're flat. A lot of it depends on how stocks behaved before the recession even started, right? So that's a big outcome-based one that we run into is, I should sell my stocks. Why? Because we're going into a recession. Why are you connecting those two things? That's not based on data. That's based on emotion, as you just said. And the other thing I wanted to talk about that you touched on as well, having to do with the election, and I don't like getting political either, so I won't. So you had these two, let's say it was just two scenarios, like it was either going to be Trump or it was going to be Biden. And so everybody would extrapolate, if Trump wins, this is going to happen. If Biden wins, this is going to happen. But guess what happened 2 days after Biden won the election? We got a COVID vaccine. And the market just poured through the roof. It had nothing to do with Biden or Trump, but you could concatenate it with the outcome of the election, even though it had nothing to do with the election because of what was going on. It's so difficult to extrapolate history into the future because there's usually something different that's going on behind the scenes. It's like the whole spurious correlation type of thing.
Mhm.
It's to say that one thing is related to another doesn't necessarily hold water. And your comment on Soros, this is one that I must have gotten 5 questions on. I don't remember his name. Who's the guy that recently made the $1.6 billion bet on a market crash? He
Oh,
was
but
the
Michael
guy.
Burry. Michael
Yeah,
Burry.
yeah. He was the
Yeah.
one who called. He was the star. He was the guy
The Big
behind Big
Short.
Short. Yeah.
Yep.
So who knows? Maybe he'll be right. Supposedly, he's making that prediction by June of next year. Um, I'm pretty sure Harry Dent made a similar prediction in either 2020 or 2021 by the
Every year.
follow.
Every year he
Right,
makes
right.
that prediction.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and he won critical acclaim because he called the peak of the Dow. That was actually a pretty bullish call of his, but he called for this the biggest stock market crash anybody has ever seen. I think it was by summer of 2022. And or I don't remember exactly when he made it, but he was well, I mean, the market went down a little bit, but he was way off.
He predicted 20 of the last 2 recessions.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's like economists have correctly predicted 10 out of the last 8 recessions.
Yeah, Peter Schiff is good at that too. He's really good at predicting recessions every year and them not happening.
Yeah. So, but I do think it's the challenge for guys like you and me, Kirk, is that this is the way our industry operates. You know, no slam on CNBC or Market Watch. I mean, these guys all get paid too, but um, the way you get viewers is to bring in people that predict things and point to past incidents that might look like the current incident when they may and may not. And it appeals to the viewer that, again, what do you know? What do you not know? And what do you think you know? Right. And for somebody who watches CNBC every day, they probably think they know more than they do because they're staying in touch with the industry. So we have a tendency to this is a business and an industry that is heavily driven by inertia, right? So just because it's been acceptable to use predictions in the past, we're going to always continue to make predictions, even though they tend to be pretty inaccurate. Correct a little bit less than 50% of the time. But there's an infrastructure. There's an infrastructure that's built on all of that, and that's what keeps that behavior going. I think our first interview together, or our first podcast together, we had a long conversation about mutual funds versus ETFs. And, my crusade is you got to get rid of your mutual funds, right? In your 401k, your 403b, you probably have to own those things. But outside of there, or even do a rollover or whatever it is, because here's all the issues with mutual funds, but you run into these behavioral biases. You run into this mindfulness issue, which is, but I'm so used to them. I'm so aware of them. And I don't know anything about the fees and expenses involved in them. And I'm too busy. Again, what I think I know, and there, my boss at BlackRock always used to tell me the one thing that among my flaws, the one thing that was good was I always knew what I didn't know. Right. And if I didn't know something, I would always go try to find the data and educate myself and ask questions and make myself very unpopular in the conference room because shut up, stop asking questions so we can all leave. But right. So it's like I've used it forever. I don't want to know anything about it. It's been fine, right? Whereas completely ignoring the tens of trillions of dollars that have gone to ETFs, I post probably once a month to say, here's how much money left mutual funds and here's how much went to go to ETFs. Want to know why? And the answer to that question is probably most of the time, no, I don't, because my behavior, my mindfulness is such that this is the thing that I'm used to and I'm comfortable with, just like predictions, just like everything else in our industry, and therefore it's going to continue. Sorry,
Yeah.
that's my soapbox answer.
No, I mean it's look, it's good, and I think one of the biggest challenges is for investors is if you're a full-time trader and you're decent, you've got a really good handle on your internal psychology, if you will. Because if you don't, you're not going to be a good trader. Like, you're just not. Like, anybody I know.
There probably isn't even really an internal psychology. They probably just have rules in place. Like
Well,
Soros, if this happens, this is what we do.
even if you have rules, people look at those and be like, oh, I could be wrong, I got to override them. It still plays in. Like, no, we're still humans, right? Machines aren't, you can program in a computer to do it for you, and there are people who do that. That's fine, but you're still programming it. And there's still, and if you're smart, there's always a button you can press to say, all right, things are broken. So if I look back at the flash crash of, when was it, 2011 or 10, when the markets just like flash crashed, I was trading the index that day. I was watching it, and I was amazed that my computer wasn't keeping up. Like, the prices were all over the place. It was like, what's going on? Like, where is the price? I couldn't even find the price. It was so crazy.
With big liquid established stocks.
Right. But the thing was, and they came out with a report, and I thought it was bunk. But my thesis around what happened was that at the time you had low liquidity because people were afraid of the market still. It was still like, people were still fresh off the 2008 crash and 2009. And people were still fresh and they were afraid. So you didn't have the same amount of ownership of stocks you had before. But what I thought was interesting was, you had a lot of black box programs and a lot of high frequency traders and a lot of that stuff that people didn't know about then, that they kind of know about now, that came out after. But all of that was providing liquidity to the market. So if you have high frequency traders providing liquidity to the market when you need liquidity and it wasn't there otherwise, then what I thought happened was they turned off their systems, because their systems weren't programmed for this. So when it started to go the other way, they just said, all right, we're just going to turn it off because we don't want to lose money. But they all did it, and there was no liquidity, which is why you couldn't see a price, because people didn't know where the price was. Nobody was making the market. You have the New York Stock Exchange, which famously was there to create the market, and the specialists get paid millions and millions of dollars a year. Well, they don't get paid, but they make millions and millions of dollars a year being the specialist, because they're the intermediary. They're the ones pairing up the buyers and the sellers, and they're making a vig on that trade so that they can make sure they're pairing them up. And the reason that they still kept their jobs for so many years is not because you needed them there. You need them there because if there were no buyers or sellers, they had to be the buyer or the seller to make that trade. So they had risk built into their profession, because in the off chance that nobody was trading, they had to step in. That was part of their licenses. They had to step in and make that trade. So that being said, I guess they still exist, but not really. It's trading's all done all these other places now. But if you don't have that liquidity, if everyone decides we're not going to trade today, well, how are you going to buy or sell? And this comes into play because, and this is not a new concept, but people have been talking about this for over 10 years, is the high yield bond market. So if you think about the bond market, right, if you're talking about treasuries, it's a very highly liquid, deep market. If you have an ETF or a mutual fund that trades these things, or not a mutual fund so much, but an ETF that has to buy and sell these things all the time, that's okay, because it's liquid. And you can always find treasuries to throw in there that'll make sense. However, if you have a high yield bond portfolio ETF, those are not liquid. And there were times back in 2017 where the oil market was melting down, and you had 3 high yield bond funds 3 days in a row, one day, next day, freeze up and close. It wasn't that their stuff went to zero. It's that the high yield bond market was frozen, and that there weren't any buyers, which means there was no price. The price was zero because nobody's willing to buy it. So the price was zero. So they couldn't liquidate it. So they said, we're going to freeze the fund and we're going to liquidate it over the next 6 months, which is the right thing to do, even though people didn't like it, because in 6 months, the high yield bond market was fine. But at the time, people were like, we have to go bankrupt. We can't pay our bills because, oil prices went from $120 down to 20. It was like, we can't make any money off 20. And we were dumb enough not to hedge it at 120. So sorry. And so what ended up happening is that froze up. But the point is that's dangerous because there was no liquidity. There was no buyer of these securities. So that's an example of why these things are important. And this is not something average investors understand because nobody talks about this. But being in this industry, like Tim and I have been in this industry for a while, and spending some times in the bowels of the financial industry and the machine, as I think about it, you hear things, you talk to people, you know how things work, and you realize, like, I don't know how this thing works on a daily basis based on this, but it does. But I know the areas it's going to break. And I know high yield bonds is a very high risk area, and preferred stocks, same thing, high risk. And ETFs, if they mass sell those things, big trouble. And all they can do is just say, well, we're either going to support it or we're going to freeze it and liquidate over time. But if people are buying something that's traded, they don't have any choice. So I don't know. I mean, you liked ETFs, Tim. So what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it actually, so two things. Number one, when you talk about the flash crash, for anybody who hasn't read it, if you're a Michael Lewis fan, Flash Boys was a phenomenal book and talked a lot about what caused things like the flash crash. And it's very interesting, like their discussions about the technology. He basically says you got one company sitting in Jersey City, and then you got another company that wants to move like one block closer in New Jersey City to New York because they're that much closer, and therefore the fiber optic cable is that much shorter, and they can get their trade done 0.1 second faster than the guy who's another block away. So really interesting stuff. But when it comes to ETFs, I think that's really important. And I think it's, people understand that stocks trade on through specialists and on markets and things like that. But there's probably less understanding about an ETF. And for those of you that have paid attention, you know that in 2019, the big firms, basically Fidelity, Schwab, and TD Ameritrade, all got rid of commissions on stock and ETF trades. And the question would always come up, particularly for people that don't do this for a living and just don't think about it. Well, I don't understand, how can Schwab and TD Ameritrade and Fidelity get rid of all of these commissions? That's a big business for them, right? So there's a couple of things. What Kirk was just talking about there was, when there's no buyer, and if you're a specialist and your job is to make a market in something, and if there is no buyer, you have to be the buyer. That's what causes what's called a spread. So Kirk alluded to the fact that you have a buyer and you have a seller, and the specialist comes in between them. If the specialist is responsible for trading Coke or AT&T or Ford or whatever, that spread's going to be very, very tight, because it's a very big liquid security. And the specialist knows, if I buy it from Kirk, I can sell it to Joe immediately. All I need is like a penny, and I'm going to do 1 million of these trades today. No big deal. But if it's Steve's AI company that went public 5 years ago and nobody knows them, and the stock trades maybe 50,000, 100,000 shares a day, the specialist is going to put a much wider spread on that, 10, 15 cents, because the specialist knows, if I go buy it from Kirk, I don't know that Joe's going to buy it from me. I might have to go find somebody else, and then I'm stuck holding this stock longer than I thought I would be. And if the price goes down, I'm, pardon the French, screwed. So I'm going to charge a wider spread in order to compensate myself and protect myself from a move in that stock while I have to hold it and get rid of it. And that happens with ETFs. In fact, if you look, here's a great example. If you look at SPY, which was actually the first ETF ever, it's an S&P 500 ETF from State Street. It has an expense ratio on it of 9 basis points, or 0.09%. There are plenty of other ETFs out there that track the S&P 500. There's VOO from Vanguard. There's IVV from BlackRock or iShares, that are much, much cheaper. I think they're both 3 basis points or 0.03% at this point. It's the ETF, so the big race to the bottom, and there's a reason for that. But in any event, why is SPY still 9 basis points and getting assets from clients when IVV and VOO are a third of the cost? And the reason for it is SPY is extremely liquid, and it has what's called an ecology around it, meaning you can trade options and futures on SPY if you want to make short-term bets on the S&P 500. So institutional investors will say, I'll pay 9 basis points to own SPY because I want that liquidity. I'm not going to own it long enough for the 9 basis points versus the 3 basis points to matter to me. I'm going to trade this thing, or I'm just going to trade options on it, whatever it might be. So that's a really important thing for folks to think about, is all of these Fidelity and TD Ameritrade and Schwab, all these big firms that got rid of their commissions, they don't necessarily care, because if they get rid of the commissions and they can get you to trade more frequently and they can turn over the positions a lot faster, they just want your volume. So put it this way, even though it didn't happen, imagine Fidelity hadn't gotten rid of their commissions and Schwab did. Where are you going to do your business? You're never going to trade at Fidelity again, because you know you can go do it for free at Schwab. So all of those things are really important, and all of that liquidity. And I know we got onto this because of the mindfulness thing, and we were talking about mutual funds versus ETFs and evolution of the industry and all of that. All of these things become much more important to the investor thought process, and there's a massive, massive learning curve.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, all this is great, Tim. Appreciate the insight. And I mean, we use SPY for the same reason. I mean, it's just if you want options on SPY, they're really tight spread. If you want to use VOO or some of the others, they don't even trade. Like, you can't even find a buyer or seller.
That's a great example, because your and my strategies are so different. I own VOO because I'm going in there to own that long term for a client. I don't have any need to trade that security. Whereas you have a very different need. You're doing more trading, more options, more alternatives, things like that. So it's worth it to you to get the extra 9 basis points, because you've got a toy that you can do more with, than the one that's much cheaper.
Yeah, and let me just raise this point. You raise a great point here, Tim. I'll mention that before we kind of wrap it up here, which is there's this fallacy that low fees are the best choice. And I say that because the whole industry, and Tim will fight me, but he'll agree with me at the same time, like, the whole industry preaches low fees, low fees, low fees. That is the answer. And who started that? Vanguard, right? Low fees, right? They're a nonprofit company. They're all about low fees. Great job. Love the idea. Love that they did that. Awesome. The problem is all people hear is low fees, low fees, low fees. And what they don't think about is low fees is how you determine two investments that are pretty much the same. Who has lower fees? Okay, well, I want the one with lower fees because I'll end up doing better. Totally agree. But if you're comparing the S&P 500 at 3 basis points to, I don't know, let's just say there's some fund, and this isn't total example, so don't call me and say I want to buy this. Let's say there's some fund that's getting you like 100% returns a year, but it's charging you 20% in fees. Would you take that over the S&P? Sign me up, right? I would take it in a flat second, because I'm going to net 80%, as opposed to the S&P, which is the index return minus 3 basis points. So I know it's an extreme example, but I use it because I don't think people stop to think about, like, it's net performance. It's not fees and it's not performance. We all like to take one or the other. Oh, what's the performance? Oh, it's this. And you don't worry about the fees. Or they say, oh, low fees. And like, what's the performance? I don't know. So you have to take both together and look at the net performance. And what are you getting? Are you willing to pay more for something that's going to produce closer to what you want? Now, if you want, like, gambling casino kind of returns, you're getting 100% or you're losing 50 or whatever, and you're willing to pay 5% for that, great, do that, right? Don't let the fees stop you. But, like, I know, I see a lot of alternative investments, right? It's just what I do. And so I see a lot of different things. I've seen some crazy stuff, right? Stuff you wouldn't believe. And I don't even want to tell you the returns because it's so crazy. But, I've seen some crazy stuff. And if that person charged me 20% to get into that thing, I would do it in a flat second, because I know what they're doing and I know the returns are crazy, and I'd happily pay 20% to get, and I'm not talking about 20% of the profits. I mean, 20% a year. Like, that's how good it is. And I'm not saying, and like I said, don't call me because it's not available. I just want to be clear. We're not selling this. It's not available to anybody. This is a private investment that somebody was doing themselves. So I don't even have access to it. Point being is, if they did that, I would happily do it, because the returns are so juicy, it's worth paying the fee. But if somebody said, I don't want to pay 20%, I'd rather pay 3 basis points. Okay. I think that's dumb, but I get it. Like, you've been brainwashed to think fees are the only thing that's important. But if you're indexing and you're comparing VOO to SPY and you're buy and hold, absolutely VOO is the best. You want to pick the one with the lowest fees. But if you're trading it, if you're looking for liquidity, if you have the ecosystem around it, like options and other strategies that need that, then you really need to pay an extra 5 basis points or 4 basis points to access something that has more benefit built in than those 4 basis points. So anyway, let's wrap it up, Tim. Final thoughts from you.
Sorry, Kirk, just one thought on that, because I actually had a great example of that, because VOO obviously at 3 basis points, GBTC is a great example of what you're talking about, because it's a Bitcoin trust that charges 2% fees. And you look at it and you go, well, geez, 2%, it's crazy. But from an investor mindset standpoint, I don't care, because the thing's returning 70%, 80%, 90% a year. And you wonder, like, at what point do Bitcoin returns, right? Do Bitcoin returns ever normalize to the point where, and it came out this week, the court, quote unquote, paved the way for a Bitcoin ETF this week. You can be sure, it's going to be, really cheap, because when BITO came out, the Bitcoin futures ETF, that was very cheap. And everybody was interviewing the Grayscale guy and asking him if they were going to lower the fees on GBTC, all that kind of stuff. But that's a great example where you don't know what the future is going to hold. And maybe the 2% will look really dumb because Bitcoin's going to go down. I mean, Bitcoin's obviously down over 65% from its high, but you look at that, and that's a place where people, even if we're just talking about 3, 4, 5 years ago, people would go, I don't give a crap about a 2% fee, because this thing's up 1,000% in the last 5 years.
That is a perfect example, and I appreciate you bringing it up so I don't get in trouble with the regulators. But GBTC is a great example of that, 2%. And I've had this question many times, because, we've owned it off and on in our portfolios, and we've had clients say, well, yeah, but it's 2%. I mean, so what? I mean, when it goes up like 700%. When it goes down 70. I mean, Am I willing? So if I think about like GBTC, some people want to buy and hold. Well, if technology is so much that you can't get a wallet and do all the stuff that you need to do in the exchanges and all that, which is complex for most people. It took me a weekend. I got frustrated and gave up, and that's why I use these instead, because it's a lot, right? And so, is it easier to do it to buy the actual crypto, or is it easier to buy GBTC? Well, for me, I can do both, by the way. Like, we do have capabilities to buy the actual crypto, but for most people who don't care about the ideology of crypto and blockchain, that just want access to it, sometimes GBTC is easier, right? Yes, you're paying 2%, but you know what? If you can get in and out quickly, and it's something that you don't have to worry about all the other technology, and you really want to, do this in a different way, and you just, 2%, I mean, how much is up this year? 100%? Do I really care about 2%? Absolutely not. Do I care about 2% when it's down 70? Sure, I care about it. But, it's so volatile that the 2% is inconsequential, because if you bought it December 31st or December 30th of last year, it's up, I don't know, it's up 120% or something crazy as of today. It's GBTC started at like 8. Now it's at 19 as of today. So it's well more than 100%.
This is saying Bitcoin's up 59.1% this year.
Yeah, but the point is it's up so much, the 2%, you're not going to care, right?
So you're up 57 instead of 59.
Right, exactly. You're not going to care. So if it's between 5 and 6%, you're paying 2%. Huge deal, right? Like, we do a lot of alternative investments, and people come to us and be like, oh, I want to invest in this thing, and it's yielding me 4%. I'm like, you're going to pay 1 to 2% in fees on that. You got all this other stuff that's going to be baked in. Why bother? It's not worth it. Like, if you're going to do something, make sure it's producing like, more than 7 is my kind of like minimum. But it's like, look at 8 to 10 to 12, 20. Like, you want something enough so that you can bake in the fees that are associated. Like, if you buy a piece of real estate, it's going to cost you 6% in and out. So you don't want to day trade real estate unless you're making 20% a day. You can't day trade it. But the point is any transaction is going to have transaction costs. And you want to make sure that you know what they are and that they're acceptable based on your philosophy. But I think as you're saying, like that's a good example is Bitcoin. But I totally agree. Once they have that ETF, it's going to be, I don't know what it'll be. It'll probably be high. It'll be under 1%. It may be like 50 basis points, but it'll still be relatively high.
60, 70, 80 basis points,
Yeah.
something like that.
It'll still be high, but because the Bitcoin futures, there's still a lot of transaction costs that go into that. The futures is there's a lot of churn and there's commissions that go into that. So I imagine it'll probably be around, between 50 and 80, maybe somewhere in there, probably. And over time it'll decrease, but still it's worth it, right? Because you have a liquid security, you can trade ETF and all that. So anyway, final thoughts from you, Tim, and where can we find more about you?
Yeah, no, this has been great. Thanks again for having me. All of our contact information and everything about what we do from a trading and a planning standpoint is on our website, www.metricfin.com. Always feel free to reach out to us with any questions. And yeah, thanks again, Kirk.
Yeah, thanks for coming on, Tim. That's the show for this week. Thank you again for joining us in Money Tree Investing Podcast. My name's Kirk Chisholm, Wealth Manager of Innovative Advisor Group. We don't just manage your wealth, we make your life better. You can find more about me at innovativewealth.com. And of course, you can find me every week here on this show. You can also check out our show at Money Tree Investing Podcast. On our website, you'll have access to the show notes, resources, and the archive shows. Please remember to subscribe on our YouTube channel for immediate access to the new shows when they're released. When you subscribe to the show, it allows us to get access to some of the top minds of investing in personal finance. While you're here, please leave a comment and question if you want us to address it on the show. Have a great week ahead, and remember, no one will care about your money like you do, so invest in your life.